Hello, welcome to Podfic Galore. I'm your horrible online reader, Goldskythe. I read out loud fanfictions for you busy bees, free of charge and no strings attached. Today I will continue reading the Silmarillion / Lord of the Rings fic by Bloodwinged Blackbird from Archive of Our Own called And Now Each Night I Count the Stars. I hope you can at least try to enjoy my voice, and I will try my best for you with the equipment available to me. Note, this fic is rated explicit. On with the show. And now each night I count the stars. Chapter 24. Muckler thought it would be midnight soon, but it was hard to say. The fog had come in overnight, and it crept beneath his clothes, cold and damp against his skin. When he touched his face, his fingers came back wet. He couldn't tell what time it was, but it seemed darker than it had been before. Muckler didn't remember the path, but his body did. Or at least he hoped it did. Perhaps he had been snared by one of the false trails that ring the valleys round, intended more to keep the wickedness out than in, but Muckler would hardly be surprised to find himself the exception. He had been this way before. He had to have been. He worried at the spot, like picking a scab, like tugging at the spot where Tooth had been lost, and he found many things in the dark that he'd like to have forgotten. Things that made him hunch and shiver, curled up panting with his hands buried in the dirt at the roots of the tree, just to convince himself that he was where he was, that he was not there. He still wasn't certain that he believed it, and he still didn't find what he was seeking. He should have reached the road by now. He was slower, yes, still weak, and with half as many legs as he'd had last time he'd made the journey. But that was why he hadn't stopped for the night. That, and the fear that if he went to sleep in this crushing darkness, then he would truly awaken. He should have reached the road. He should have remembered the way. There was a sound in the darkness, a sharp crack, a rustling of leaves to the ground, a buzzing, rushing sound that vibrated through the stones beneath his feet. The path had been soft with pine straw just a moment ago. Do you think you are free? When the light came, it was raining, great fat drops sliding down the pine needles, pausing for a second at their end to sparkle in the dull grey dawn before dropping to the earth below. Muckler was soaked to the bone, muscles that were no longer accustomed to travel now stiff and sore, seized up as he had been shivering all night. He took a shallow breath and lifted his head to look at the water, flowing fast, turned up high and muddy with rain flowing down the heights. He had reached the Bruinen. Elrond should have been harder to escape, but then maybe he'd underestimated himself. Muggler had always been good at leaving. I keep the things that are mine. His shoulder twitched, but he was too tired to keep running from the voice. It was in his ears, in the bones of his jaw. It was why he couldn't sing, why his fingers couldn't find no purchase on the strings of the lute. It was part of him now, the only thing he could hear, music itself, silenced beneath its roar, and one day it would find a way to use him. He wrapped his arms tighter about himself, as if he could make himself smaller, could hide himself from the eye. He should have stolen one of Glorfindel's cloaks. The ford was tricky. His bare foot tried to grip the slick stones, the tips of the walking sticks sinking into the soft mud between them whenever he tried to bear his weight on one of them. His toes were numb by the time he was halfway across. The water still icy with the snows above, and it made him even clumsier. He made it to the far shore where, on the last step, he tripped and fell upon the bank. He lay there, chest heaving, sand between his lips. The other side of the river was gone, wrapped in drifts of fog like undyed wool, like the river had carried away the sparkling valley of Imladris, as if the world stopped at the water's edge. There was a muffled sort of world that remained, an unfinished, blurry painting of a day. The sand was real, sharp-edged and gritty on his cheek, between his teeth when he clamped his jaws together and stood. He wondered if he'd ever be able to find his way back. He hoped not. The lute was out of tune. Muckler hoped that the lute was out of tune. Maybe it was the damp. Maybe the neck had warped somehow, imperceptibly, when he had thrown it. Maybe that's why the strings wouldn't hold a pitch, no matter how he checked the intervals. It didn't matter what he did, how he twisted the pegs, how pure and clear they sounded when plucked singly. As soon as he tried to play a tune, strum a chord, they jangled together. A mighty cacophony that a child would have been ashamed of. The fault was not in his fingers. They were nimble, still remembering scales, running up and down the neck of the lute, picking out complex patterns on the strings, just as they had ever done. But still, it was wrong. It was all wrong. The unresolved chord held no tension, the resolution no satisfaction. Modes that once made him weep held no magic. He played until his fingertips bled, but the fault was not with the lute, not with his hands, perhaps not even with the music. It was simply that he could not hear it. He shivered. He might have built a fire, but not yet. He twisted a peg and plucked a string. Perhaps, if he tried again. Maklo kept to the road. He could remember the other paths he could take, wandering paths through the wild, secret routes he might take. Hidden wonders and comfortable campsites. He still knew the ways. Knew where there would be mushrooms in the fall, where hares would be trapped, where there was good, clean water and good deep spots for swimming. He wouldn't find what he was looking for there. He wouldn't find it on the road either, but at least the road was easier. The walking sticks were not so bad. He was slow, and he tried faster than he once had, but after a few days he had largely gotten the knack of walking, with propping an elbow on one of the sticks so he could balance but could have the use of both hands. Maybe he would never be as quick as he had been before, but he didn't find himself inclined to sleep, so perhaps it evened out. A fortnight of travel brought him to settled lands. High summer had come in, and with the smell of firewood that teased at his memory. He did not stop in Bree. He remembered Bree well enough, or thought he did at any rate. The holes in his memory were like that, though. He'd be in a place that felt familiar, sometimes painfully so, only to suddenly stumble, tumbling headfirst into an unfamiliar room, a sensation with no source, a wisp of a conversation with no partner, an entire, kind-faced, green-eyed lover that he would have sworn he had never seen before, except that his whole chest had felt strange and tight when he had sent him away. He couldn't face him. Couldn't face Bree. Couldn't stand the thought that he would be known there, would be asked for songs, would find maybe whole new oceans of things he had forgotten, would again have to wonder why. He passed the city to the north, and found a field of brambles, laden with tart red berries, and ate as he walked, staining his hands like blood, leaving his lips sticky sweet, and when he had eaten enough to make his stomach hurt, he thought that maybe that, at least, was real. Across the summer fields, he found a road leading through the wood, rutted where wagon wheels had driven through mud and the sun had baked it dry. Near a farm he stumbled, one of his walking stick caught in a hole. He wrenched himself upright, looking steadfastly away from the yard where he could almost hear children chanting, "Blackbird! Blackbird!" after him. He closed his eyes against the memory, almost ready to flee, afraid what other phantoms might lurk in this little village. He was tired. Tired of the slow and clumsy journey, tired of the fear that dogged his every step, that kept him awake at night, staring at the stars as if they'd disappear if he looked away for too long. It didn't have to change anything if he went to the village. It didn't matter if he remembered something, and it didn't matter if he didn't. He didn't have to stay, and he didn't have to return. They'd thought him dead many times over. What it would hurt for them to all believe it again? What would it hurt to make it true? So, a rest did not have to change anything. He would visit this village and then walk on, back to the sea, and maybe he would not stop. Maddie was at the forge, walking her new apprentice through shaping a simple hook, when she heard the scream. Without a thought, she was running, hammer and dumbfounded apprentice both left behind, tearing across the cluttered yard between the forge and her rooms. The door stood open. Varda was backed up into a corner, eyes wide. She had been spinning, soft cloud of wool still gripped in one hand, dropped spindle flashing on the floor where she had dropped it in a pool of sunlight, trailing the newborn yarn behind. She saw Maddie and shook her head frantically, making an appeasing motion with her hands. Maddie stopped in the doorway, hidden in the shadows, and tried to clear the sun dazzle from her eyes. I don't know you. A voice croaked from within the room. Varda's eyes flashed from Maddie to someone she couldn't quite see. Of course you don't. I don't know you either. Varda laughed a little, her hand bobbing up to her throat. She always laughed when she was nervous. What is it? Maddie winced. There was Adele, dashing up the stairs behind her, hammer still in hand. It took him a bit to catch on sometimes, but he was enthusiastic once he knew what was happening. Sometimes a bit too much so. There was a scuffle in the room, and Maddie couldn't make much sense of what was going on as she and Adele tumbled through the door that was quite suddenly wrenched open. She tried to run for Varda, but got tripped up on something, barking her shins and falling down. Adele got the same treatment, hitting the floor with a grunt. Maddie! I'm not hurt. Trust Varda to be worried about her at a moment like this, but then perhaps she was the one in danger after all, since the intruder rushed for her. Quick as a snake, he was on the floor beside her, a confusion of what seemed like too many long, skinny limbs and unpleasantly strong fingers that scrabbled at her shoulders and grabbed her jaw to make her look at him. His eyes were huge and dark, shining bright as the night, but sunk deeper than she remembered. He was scarred now, his cheek hollowed like they had been cut out with a knife, hair shorn but graying at the temples, once fine clothes that looked like he'd been sleeping in them for a month. But she knew him. Master Blackbird! He blinked at her and let go of her chin, sitting back on his rump, eyes darting about the room like he was just now seeing it. He rubbed at his face, chest heaving, thin shoulders high and tense, his hands shaking in a way she had never seen them do. He fumbled beside himself, scrambling upright with the help of 2 sticks. The left leg ended where the knee should have been, the leg in his breeches tied out of the way. She sat up and Varda ran over to her, hands at her shoulders. Maddie turned, pressed a quick kiss to the back of her hand, looked up at the blackbird. I'm sorry, he whispered, quick and desperate. I know you, but I don't remember. I don't. I'll go. Don't, said Maddie as she took Varda's hand and clambered to her feet, brushing off her skirts, and then turning to help Adele up. He was looking even more mystified than usual, and she couldn't quite blame him this time. You can stay if you can refrain from frightening folks for half a minute. Adele, run down to Hammond's and see if he's about. Tell him the blackbird's come back. She pinched the bridge of her nose at his blank look. Just tell him. He'll know who you mean. Adele nodded, brown hair flopping into his eyes. Varda glanced at her for a second, then stepped forward, and if Maddie hadn't known better, she had almost have thought the earlier fright forgotten, but she could still see the tension in the line of Varda's back. Come, sit down. You look fit to fall over. He looked at Maddie as if asking if it was safe, and she almost laughed at the thought. Go on, you great fool. Imagine you being scared of us when you're the one accosting women in their homes, she scolded. He led him over to a little chair where he hunched himself up, shoulders so high it made Maddie's hurt to just look at him. Now, stop looking at us like we're gonna eat you, and tell me what you've gone and done to yourself. Once he did that, maybe he should ask for an explanation why his howl had come through a month before as woebegone as he had ever known a man to look, but she thought it might send Blackbird skittering off if she was too terribly serious about it all. Are you thirsty? Asked Varda beside her, and Maddie could have hit herself for not thinking of it, but then Varda was practical like that. He nodded, and Varda looked quick at Maddie. Go on, Master Blackbird's an old friend. Why do you call me that? He said when Varda had left. It's your name, or rather, it's the only name I've ever heard for you. I don't. You don't remember, I gathered. But you know me. I know that I know you. Get it over me, I reckon. But not for you, I expect. He shook his head at that once, then glanced at the door, an eyebrow raised. No, you have not met Varda. She came over from Archet, just a bit after you left. It's about 2 years gone. Adele just came to me and apprenticed this spring past. Why did she go back? If you don't remember us. His mouth twisted, something like the wry way she remembered. I was going to the sea. To sail? She stopped at the look he gave her. That's what you folk do, isn't it? Not me. Then never mind. She decided that sounded like a conversation she was too rattled to have at the moment. Well, maybe the legs remember where your head can't. They knew you'd be welcome here. She stopped and thought for a second. You know, maybe your legs are the wisest part of you. So you could say I've only lost half my wits? She nodded and clapped him on the shoulder. Not so bad as you thought, then, is it? Mary and Haman had conferred, while Varda had pushed pastries and baths on Blackbird without much success. Haman finally produced a bottle of wine, which seemed to be sufficient to earn Blackbird's trust, for he agreed to go out to Haman's, where he'd no doubt wind up tucked in the corner of the barn again. He'd followed Haman away, pigably enough, indeed, seeming nearly as relieved as Varda had been that Mary hadn't invited him to stay in their rooms. I wouldn't have minded, you know, Varda said, strolling up behind Maddie where she sat at the bedside. She tucked her pointed little chin on Maddie's shoulder and breathed on her neck to make her laugh. I would have, said Maddie, leaning her head back for a kiss. Varda smiled against her lips and slipped a hand into the neck of tunic to touch the skin over her heart. You're right, of course. I'd have felt strange doing this with him asleep in the next room. Maddie sucked in a breath as Varda pinched her nipple. He doesn't sleep. Not so far as I've seen. Oh, that's even worse then, she said, lips warm and wet at Maddie's ear. She paused and pulled away a bit. He's not much like what I imagined, you know. He's not much like he was before, either. Varda crawled up to sit beside her. You're worried. A bit, Maddie admitted, truly enough. I'll be needing something to distract me, or I'll be talking and thinking about it all night. She turned and tumbled Varda back to the bed and buried her face in the valley between Varda's tits. Varda laughed and combed her fingers through Maddie's hair. Well then, I'm sure I can oblige, but it'll be a chore. What will you do for me in return? Maddie was already pulling up the hem of her shift. I've been thinking about this all day. Liar. Maddie batted her eyes up at Varda, all innocent. Truly, before I saw who it was and I thought you had fallen into the clutches of a murderer, all I could think of was how much I'd miss this. She wrapped her arms around Varda's thighs and kissed her soft belly. Just that, teased Varda, a little smile in her voice. Well, not just that. I also like your pies. Varda hit her with a pillow. So, can you play the thing, or are you just carrying it about for show? Maddie asked as Makla watched her work at the forge. I can't play it. Not anymore. But you still keep it with you? He shrugged. Haman, or his wife, more likely, had cleaned him up, dressed him in some clean clothes, but it only made him look worse somehow. More gaunt, more Jill. His color poor, eyes sunken, muscle wasted. The uncanny elvish grace gone as he moved all cautious and stiff, huddling small or skittering away at any sudden sound. Can't sing anymore either. You never sang for us here. I feel like I should take offense. Come, look at this. She held up a joint that she had been working on, swinging it so he could see the hinge move. Then he twisted a lever at one side and the mechanism locked in place. He watched all this with eyes that were glassy, uninterested. She wondered if he had been at the wine again. What do you think? It's very clever. It's your knee, your goose. She passed it over to him. Well, do you think it'll serve? I have a carpenter friend who can help with the rest. Blackbird just held it, his hand shaking, and then, oh, light. She didn't think she could take it if he got it into his head to cry.
Oh, don't look like that. I'll be good for naught if you cry at me.
Why would you do this?
You did me a kindness once. Besides, this hardly ever counts, as it is something I wanted to do. Would you stop that?
It wasn't me, he said. She'd have considered hitting him if he weren't in such a sorry state. It was Blackbird. Maddie took the joint back from him and set it on the workbench with a thunk.
Would you believe, she remarked, that before I met you, I had some harebrained notion that elves were wise? I've no idea who you think you are now, but to us, you'll be our Blackbird, whether you like it or no. Now, sit you down there and tell me what's happened to make you think you're so awful you can't accept a gift from an old friend. And while we're at it, tell me what happened to your Hal that had him come through here looking worse than when he thought you were dead.
You knew about that?
Knew about what? I had your fellow sopping in my forge for a month. And now you're back and he's not with you, and I tell you, I've never seen a pair look as sorry as the two of you. Now, here's vodka, and no doubt she's got some pastry in that basket of hers, and I'll pretend not to notice the wine you nicked from old Hammond, and we'll sit down here and have ourselves a proper talk.
So, you don't remember Hal at all? Maddie asked later, while Blackbird watched from the corner, lute in his lap, hands hovering over the strings like he was thinking about playing, but couldn't quite bring himself to risk it. He gave her a look, sharp and suspicious. I know him the way I know you. I see him, and he feels familiar. He feels safe.
Seems to me that feeling safe would be a good thing for you.
He grunted and plucked at a string, so soft he couldn't hear the note.
He came through here, a few weeks back.
How did he seem? He struck another string with his thumb. He could hear this one, clear and ringing. He let it fade, then took a draught from the bottle beside him.
How'd you think?
She turned over the leg to hammer another rivet into the leather straps.
He looked better than you, but that's only because you look like something a crow would be too proud to pick at.
Blackbird huffed a laugh at that and struck a chord. Are you going to disappear again? Maddie asked, suddenly sad at the thought.
To sea or wherever you go?
He frowned, fingers moving quickly up the neck of the lute, playing the shapes of the chords lightly, not sounding the notes, just chasing the patterns. She could hear a faint whisper and scrape of his fingers on the strings.
Will you at least talk to Hal before you do?
She swallowed, thinking how she'd feel if it were her instead of Hal. How she'd not turn away the last sight of Varda, no matter how things were between them. He didn't reply, running through another soundless scale.
Would you stop that and just play something already? I don't care if you don't answer me, just stop tormenting yourself with the thing.
He froze, like a rabbit that's seen a hawk.
I'm sorry,
she said, embarrassed at her outburst. Don't be, he said, and bent back to the lute, fingers steady on its neck, and he let his thumb fall across the strings, plucked on at a time. You're most likely right.
Of course I am, she said. What are you going to do about it?
The corner of his mouth twisted up in a smile, and he looked away. I'm going to play you a song. End of chapter 24. Stay tuned.
Crow. Crow.